The German radio operator's voice cracked with disbelief. One moment the convoy was moving calmly along the gray waters of the English Channel. The ships kept their steady formation, engines rumbling as they carried ammunition, fuel, and supplies toward the ports of occupied France. The next moment, an American fighter burst out of the fog. It came in low, so low that sailors on the decks could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy. The aircraft roared over the water like a bullet, and within seconds the convoy erupted into chaos. Flak batteries opened fire. Guns thundered from every ship. Officers shouted orders across the radio network while helmsmen spun their wheels, trying to maneuver away from an enemy no one had even seen coming. One airplane, one pilot, and an entire convoy suddenly fighting for survival. But the real question wasn't what that fighter destroyed that day. The real question was something far stranger. How had a single American Navy fighter ended up hunting German ships along the coast of occupied France in the first place? The English Channel in the spring of 1944 was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. To the south lay the fortress of Nazi-occupied Europe. Concrete bunkers lined the French coastline. Radar towers watched the skies. Thousands of soldiers guarded the beaches that Adolf Hitler believed the Allies would eventually try to invade. To the north stretched southern England, where thousands of Allied aircraft crowded airfields carved into the countryside. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, transport aircraft. The greatest armada of air power the world had ever seen was gathering there, preparing for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. Between those two forces churned the cold waters of the Channel. Gray, restless, a narrow corridor where armies and empires had fought for centuries. Now it had become the front line of the coming invasion. For the German Coastal Command, the Channel was both a lifeline and a vulnerability. Supply convoys moved constantly along the French coastline. Cargo ships carried ammunition, food, vehicles, and fuel from port to port, helping the German army strengthen the Atlantic Wall, the massive defensive network designed to stop an Allied invasion. Escort vessels protected the convoys. Each ship bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Shore batteries along the coast added even more firepower. And when available, Luftwaffe fighters patrolled overhead. But by early 1944, the Luftwaffe was stretched thin. German aircraft were desperately needed on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were grinding their way westward. That meant many Channel convoys relied mostly on ships and coastal guns for protection. The Germans tried to move their ships at night. Convoys slipped along the coast in darkness, hoping to reach port before sunrise exposed them to Allied aircraft. But by 1944, the skies above the Channel were rarely empty. American and British reconnaissance aircraft photographed every harbor. Fighter bombers prowled the shipping lanes. The Allies were tightening their grip on the sea, preparing the battlefield for the invasion that would soon change the course of the war. Among the units flying those dangerous missions were aircraft few people expected to see in European skies. U.S. Navy fighters. Planes like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the older F-4F Wildcat, aircraft designed for aircraft carriers and island battles across the Pacific. Yet war had strange logistics. Some Navy squadrons now operated from land bases in England, flying coastal patrols alongside the Army Air Forces. Their mission was simple: find German convoys, destroy them, return alive if possible. Flying over the Channel was miserable work. The weather rarely cooperated. Low cloud ceilings hung over the water. Fog rolled in without warning. Rain smeared across cockpit windshields until pilots could barely see the horizon. Navigation often depended on instinct. Pilots learned to recognize coastlines through small breaks in the clouds. They memorized the shapes of rivers, harbors, and cliffs. Sometimes survival depended on recognizing a single landmark through a gap in the fog. The German defenses were formidable. Escort ships carried 20mm and 37mm cannons capable of tearing apart low-flying aircraft. Larger vessels mounted 88mm guns, powerful weapons originally designed to destroy tanks, but deadly against aircraft as well. Coastal artillery batteries added even more firepower. The result was a layered storm of steel. To attack a convoy meant flying directly into it. Most pilots did it anyway. The roar of a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine at full power was unforgettable. A deep, hammering thunder that shook the aircraft and vibrated through the pilot's chest. The Hellcat was a massive fighter, heavier than most of its enemies, built strong enough to survive carrier landings and brutal Pacific dogfights. But over the channel it proved equally suited for another job: convoy hunting. The missions followed a grim pattern. Take off before dawn, climb through the overcast, cross the channel at altitude, then descend through the clouds and search the coastline for German shipping. If a convoy was spotted, the fighters attacked quickly. One pass, maybe two, then escape before German fighters arrived. Some days the pilots found nothing, only empty water and nearly empty fuel tanks. Other days they found convoys, and those missions could turn deadly very quickly. One of the pilots flying those missions was Lieutenant James William Pickins. Everyone in the squadron simply called him Pick. He came from the farmland of central Illinois, where endless fields stretched toward the horizon, and the most exciting event most weeks was a thunderstorm rolling across the prairie. Pick had learned to fly in an old, open-cockpit biplane at a grass airstrip outside his hometown. He paid for lessons by working summers on neighboring farms. When the war began, the Navy found him in 1942, one of thousands of young Americans drawn to aviation by equal parts patriotism and the simple desire to fly. He earned his wings at Pensacola, surviving a brutal training program where nearly half of the cadets washed out before graduation. Those who remained became naval aviators. Pick was among them. Soon he was assigned to a fighter squadron forming on the West Coast. His first months in the fleet taught lessons no classroom could provide: the controlled terror of landing on an aircraft carrier pitching in heavy seas, the exhaustion of flying long patrols in tropical heat, and the strange brotherhood of the ready room, where young men who might not survive the week played cards and told stories about their lives before the war. Pick rarely talked much. He watched. He studied the experienced pilots carefully, how they checked their aircraft, how they positioned themselves in formation, how their heads constantly moved, scanning the sky. Every detail became another lesson, another entry in the mental library of survival he was building. By the time his squadron received orders transferring them to England in late 1943, Pick had already logged more than 400 hours in Grumman fighters. He had learned an important truth about combat flying. Survival was rarely about luck alone. It was about calculations, fuel, altitude, timing, knowing where the guns were, and how to avoid them. The transition to Europe surprised many Navy pilots. The weather was colder, darker, far wetter than anything they had experienced in the Pacific, and German defenses were disciplined and precise. But flying itself was still a mathematical problem, and Pick was very good at solving problems. His first Channel patrol in January 1944 found nothing but freezing wind and gray water. His second mission discovered a small convoy near the Brittany coast: 3 cargo ships, 2 escort vessels. The flight leader made 2 strafing passes before flak became too intense and ordered the fighters home. Pick watched carefully. He studied the tracers arcing up from the ships. He noticed how gunners aimed at the first aircraft diving toward the convoy. He memorized the rhythm of the guns. Another lesson. Week after week he flew patrols along the French coast. Gradually, he learned the moods of the channel, where fog banks formed, where currents could disrupt navigation, which sections of coastline were heavily defended, and where small gaps existed in German flak coverage. He also learned patience. The best attack opportunities belonged to pilots who waited, who studied their targets, who struck at the perfect moment. Young pilots often rushed their attacks. They approached at obvious angles, predictable paths, exactly what the German gunners expected. Pick was different. He was calculating. The other pilots noticed. Flight leaders began requesting him for the most difficult missions, the ones that required calm nerves and precise flying. By the spring of 1944, James Pickins was only 23 years old, and he was already leading his own section of fighters. But there was a problem, a mathematical one. German convoys were becoming harder to destroy, and Allied losses were climbing. The commanders responsible for the anti-shipping campaign over the Channel faced a problem that looked simple on paper and deadly in reality. Send more aircraft, and the convoy's defenses might be overwhelmed. But more aircraft also meant greater coordination problems and heavier losses to flak. Send fewer aircraft, and the fighters rarely carried enough firepower to seriously damage the convoy before the German guns drove them away. Some officers proposed a different solution. Why not let the 8th Air Force handle it? Heavy bombers could flatten the ports entirely, destroying the convoys before they ever sailed. But the bombers had their own priorities: synthetic oil plants, aircraft factories, rail networks, ball bearing plants, the industrial backbone of Germany. Compared to those targets, coastal shipping ranked far lower on the strategic list. That meant convoy interdiction remained the responsibility of fighter bombers. And fighter bombers were dying too quickly. The cost of the campaign was measured in quiet ways across southern England. Empty chairs at breakfast. Lockers suddenly cleared out. Letters written to families who would soon receive telegrams instead. New pilots arrived to replace the missing men. Young aviators with fresh wings and little combat experience. They needed time to learn the dangers of the channel. Weeks of seasoning. But many of them never received those weeks. Pick watched the attrition with the detached focus of someone who could not stop analyzing the numbers. He ran the calculations in his head. Sortie rates, loss percentages, probability curves. The results were grim. At current loss rates, a pilot flying channel missions had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of completing his full tour. Those odds were worse than many sectors of the Pacific War, and the channel offered almost no chance of rescue. A pilot who ditched into the icy water might survive only minutes. A pilot who reached the French coast faced capture. Something had to change. The problem, Pick realized, was predictability. Every convoy attack followed the same pattern. Fighters approached at medium altitude. They dove toward the ships. They fired during the pass. Then they pulled up through the flak and escaped. German gunners knew the pattern by heart. They had rehearsed it hundreds of times. Their weapons were calibrated for it. Their aim improved with every engagement. Pick began asking himself a simple question. What if the fighters attacked in a way the Germans didn't expect? The idea developed slowly. It did not arrive as a sudden flash of inspiration. Instead, it grew from observation and calculation. Pick studied after-action reports. He spoke with pilots who had survived multiple convoy attacks. He asked specific questions. How quickly did gunners react? Which angles produced the heaviest fire? Where were the blind spots? Gradually, a pattern appeared. German flak was powerful, but it wasn't infinitely flexible. Guns had limits. They could only turn so far, only elevate so quickly, and the crews operating them needed time to react. Convoys themselves created confusion. Multiple ships, multiple gun crews, overlapping fields of fire, but also overlapping mistakes. Communication between ships often broke down once an attack began. Under pressure, coordination collapsed. Pick realized something important. If a fighter approached fast enough, low enough, and from an unexpected direction, the gunners might not react in time. The idea was dangerous. Flying extremely low meant entering the kill zone of every light weapon on every ship. One lucky hit to the engine or cockpit would send the aircraft straight into the water. But flying high had already proven deadly. Medium-altitude attack runs exposed aircraft to coordinated flak from multiple ships. The question was simple. Which risk offered a better chance of survival? Pick believed he knew the answer. He first presented the idea during a weather stand-down in March 1944. Rain hammered the metal roof of the briefing hut while pilots crowded around a table covered in maps. Pick explained his thinking carefully. Approach from an unexpected direction. Use the sun, clouds, or terrain for concealment. Drop to wavetop height, below the effective arc of the heavier guns. Strike fast, then escape before the lighter weapons could track the aircraft properly. The theory made sense, but the execution sounded almost insane. One of the pilots pointed out the obvious danger. Flying that low over water at combat speed left no margin for error. A moment of distraction, a misjudged wave, and the aircraft would fly straight into the sea. Pick agreed. But he also pointed out something equally obvious. The current tactics were already killing pilots. At least this approach forced the Germans to react instead of waiting for predictable attack patterns. The proposal eventually reached the squadron commander. He listened carefully, asked questions about fuel consumption, weapon loads, and escape routes. Then he declined the request. The orders were clear. Squadron strength attacks at prescribed altitudes. No deviations. No freelancing. Pick accepted the decision. He was a Navy officer. Orders were orders, but the idea stayed in his mind, and he waited for the right moment. That moment arrived on a gray morning in late April 1944. The mission was a routine armed reconnaissance. 4 Hellcats sweeping the coastline between Brest and Saint Nazaire. Intelligence suggested a convoy might attempt the run between those ports using bad weather as cover. The weather was miserable. Low clouds hung only a few hundred feet above the sea. Fog drifted across the water in shifting banks. The flight leader nearly aborted the mission twice, but each time a break in the clouds convinced him to continue. Then, shortly after 0630, the convoy appeared. 4 cargo ships, 2 escort vessels. They emerged from a fog bank about 15 miles off the French coast. The ships moved slowly northeast towards safety. The flight leader radioed the sighting report. Then he began climbing. Standard procedure. Gain altitude. Assess defenses. Coordinate the attack. Pick acknowledged the order. But as he pulled back on the stick, something caught his eye. The fog. It wasn't uniform. Some banks were thin. Others were dense enough to hide entire ships. And one thick wall of fog was drifting toward the convoy's rear escort, blocking its view completely. In that moment, Pick made a decision. He broke formation. The Hellcat rolled out of its climb and dove toward the water. The aircraft leveled off at 50 feet above the waves, lower than most pilots ever dared to fly in combat. Behind him, the radio erupted with shouting. His wingman demanded to know what he was doing. The flight leader barked orders for him to return to formation. Pick said nothing. He was counting seconds, adjusting his heading, using the fog bank as cover. The convoy appeared suddenly through the mist. Huge shapes emerging from the gray sea. Pick's thumb flipped the gun switch. 6 .50 caliber machine guns waited in the wings. He approached from the convoy's starboard quarter, exactly where the escort ship's view had been blocked. Sailors on the cargo ships were just beginning to react. Then the Hellcat opened fire. The first burst ripped across the lead ship's bridge. Windows exploded. Steel plates tore open. Pick banked left, crossing the bow of the next ship and firing again. A lifeboat disintegrated. Deck equipment exploded into sparks and splinters. Flak began to rise, but it was scattered, uncoordinated. The gunners were trying to track a target already past them. Tracers streaked above the Hellcat. Behind it, nowhere close enough to hit. German radio channels erupted in confusion. Reports of an American fighter inside the convoy. Requests for position. Orders shouted across multiple frequencies. But no one knew where the aircraft actually was. Pick pulled up just high enough to clear the masts of the ships. Then he dropped back down to wave height on the opposite side of the convoy. The second escort vessel turned hard, trying to bring its guns to bear. But the maneuver exposed its bridge. Pick fired again. The burst tore across the superstructure before the gunners could react. 30 seconds. That was how long the attack lasted. Then the Hellcat vanished back into the fog. Behind him, the convoy was in chaos. Ships scattered in different directions. Gunners fired blindly into empty air. When the remaining 3 American fighters arrived moments later, they found a target already disorganized and vulnerable. They dove into the attack. This time the convoy could not defend itself properly. When the American aircraft finally turned for home, the damage was severe. A cargo ship burned fiercely. Another was sinking. A third drifted helplessly in the water. And no American aircraft had been lost. The debriefing was tense. The flight leader was furious. Breaking formation was dangerous. Ignoring orders could get pilots killed. Discipline kept squadrons alive. But the intelligence officer in the room listened carefully. He took notes, because the results spoke for themselves. A convoy strike with no American losses, and a new tactic that deserved serious attention. The following aircraft approached the convoy only moments after Pick disappeared back into the fog. But the scene they found no longer resembled the organized formation they had expected. The German ships were scattered. Helmsmen had turned sharply in every direction, trying to evade an attacker whose position no one could clearly identify. Gun crews fired wildly into the mist, unsure whether they were facing a single aircraft or an entire squadron hidden somewhere in the clouds. The confusion was exactly what Pick had hoped for, and it worked. The 3 American fighters dove into the attack using conventional tactics, but this time the convoy's defenses were broken. Flak bursts appeared late and scattered. Gunners struggled to coordinate their fire. By the time the American aircraft finally pulled away, the convoy had been devastated. 2 cargo ships were sinking. Another drifted helplessly, engines dead. 1 escort vessel burned fiercely, smoke rising into the gray sky above the channel. The convoy mission had been effectively destroyed. Pick's own aircraft, however, had not escaped untouched. During his third pass, a 20mm shell had struck the Hellcat's wing root. Hydraulic lines were severed. Control surfaces stiffened as pressure drained from the system. Moments later, another burst shattered part of his canopy, sending shards of plexiglass across his face and arms. Blood ran down his flight jacket as he turned the damaged aircraft toward England. The flight home was a test of endurance. The Hellcat's controls grew heavier with every passing minute. Every correction required brute strength. But Pick kept the aircraft in the air. The landing was anything but graceful. With hydraulics failing and brakes barely responding, the Hellcat slammed onto the runway and skidded across the tarmac before ground looping into the grass beside the airstrip. Ground crews rushed forward. They pulled Pick from the cockpit, his face streaked with blood, but his eyes still clear. His first question surprised everyone. Did we lose anyone? The answer was no. Every aircraft had returned. Only then did Pick ask about the convoy. The intelligence officer delivered the report. 3 cargo vessels destroyed or disabled. 1 escort burning. Convoy mission prevented. Pick simply nodded. Someone handed him a cigarette while medics examined the cuts across his face. Within a week, he would be flying again. 2 days later, the war changed forever. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in human history had begun. Suddenly, the German convoys along the Channel coast became a secondary concern. The war's focus shifted towards supporting the invasion itself and pushing inland through France. But the lessons learned during those dangerous months of convoy interdiction did not disappear. Instead, they spread quietly throughout Allied air forces. Reports circulated. Pilots discussed the tactics in briefing rooms. Training manuals began to evolve. The low-level attack approach pioneered by Pick was adopted and adapted by other squadrons. Different variations appeared. Some pilots changed the approach angle. Others adjusted altitude or timing. But the central idea remained the same. Surprise created confusion. Confusion weakened defenses. And weakened defenses meant fewer dead pilots. By the summer of 1944, operational statistics began reflecting the change. Loss rates on convoy interdiction missions dropped noticeably. Damage to German shipping increased. Allied analysts credited several factors. Better aircraft, more experienced pilots. German defenses stretched thin. But buried inside the reports were references to new tactical methods, ideas that had not existed in pre-war doctrine, ideas born from combat. Pick's name rarely appeared in official documents. Military organizations rarely credit individuals. Success belongs to units, to commands, to doctrine. But the pilots who flew with him knew exactly where the idea had begun. After the war, many of those pilots wrote memoirs or participated in oral history interviews. Their stories told the same pattern. A quiet young pilot, a fog-covered convoy, and a low-level attack that changed the way missions were flown. One veteran interviewed decades later described the difference simply. Before Pick's run, he said, every mission felt like playing Russian roulette. Afterward, it felt more like chess. Still dangerous, but with moves, strategies, ways to shift the odds. German records captured after the war offered unexpected confirmation. Reports written by convoy commanders repeatedly mentioned attacks by low-flying aircraft appearing suddenly from fog or cloud. Gunners struggled to track them. Radio communications collapsed into confusion. Orders overlapped. Ships maneuvered dangerously close to one another, trying to evade attackers that seemed to appear from nowhere. One German naval officer, interrogated by British intelligence in 1945, described the problem clearly. Before, he explained, the attacks came from above in patterns we understood. Then they came from everywhere. Any direction, any height. We could not predict them. We could not prepare. He never knew the name of the pilot who had first demonstrated the tactic. But he remembered the effect. James William Pickins survived the war. He continued flying missions through the liberation of France and into the autumn of 1944 before eventually rotating back to the United States. During the final months of the war, he served as a flight instructor, passing on hard-earned lessons to younger naval aviators preparing for combat. When the war ended, Pick returned to Illinois. He finished the college education the war had interrupted, married the woman he had known since childhood, and settled into a quiet life, farming the same land his grandfather had worked decades earlier. He rarely spoke about the war. When younger relatives asked questions, he described the aircraft, the cold channel wind, the endless gray water. But he avoided stories about danger or death. Occasionally, among other veterans, fragments emerged. He once described the channel itself. How the gray water seemed to swallow color and sound. How ships looked from 50 feet above the waves, enormous and fragile at the same time. How flak tracers drifted past the canopy like slow lightning, each one a message that missed. When people suggested that he had invented new tactics, Pick usually dismissed the idea. Good pilots figure out what works, he said. Nothing special about it. But history suggested otherwise. In 1987, a naval historian researching convoy interdiction operations discovered a series of after-action reports tracing the development of low-level attack tactics. The trail eventually led to Pick. By then he was 72 years old, living quietly on his farm. The historian wrote requesting an interview. Pick agreed. They spoke for nearly 3 hours in the farmhouse living room. Family photographs lined the walls. Books about agriculture filled the shelves. And above the fireplace hung a framed photograph of a Hellcat fighter. Pick calmly explained his reasoning. The calculations. The fog. The moment he realized the convoy's defenses could be broken. When asked what he thought his legacy might be, he paused for a long time. Then he answered quietly. The war killed a lot of good men, he said. Men who followed orders. Men who did everything right. Men who just ran out of luck. He looked at the photograph above the fireplace. If anything I figured out gave some of them a better chance, that's enough. Not glory. Not credit. Just fewer letters going to fewer families. He paused again. That's the only legacy that matters. The ones who came home. James William Pickins died in 1994 at the age of 79. His obituary mentioned his farming, his church, his family, but not the war. Yet his influence remains. Inside naval aviation doctrine. Inside pilot training. Inside tactics still built on surprise, disruption, and calculated audacity. He found a better way to fight, and then he gave it away. And somewhere in the vast mathematics of war, the calculations of a quiet pilot from Illinois are still saving lives.